Welcome to the Mayor of Money podcast series. I'm Rick Goldring, and many of you know me as the Mayor of Burlington between 2010 and 2018. However, I've spent the vast majority of my career in the financial services sector, serving successful business owners and helping them with the areas of financial estate planning and wealth and risk management. Now, my career continued in the financial services sector in 2019 with the establishment of Goldring Financial Leadership. Now, the Mayor of Money podcast series is going to feature discussion on estate and financial planning, on entrepreneurship, as well as real estate and development. My guests are going to include a wide variety of people in different roles, from financial planners, investment people, life insurance specialists, tax lawyers, accountants, developers, urban planners like we have today, a wide variety of people. And on the program, you will hear insightful information that you can use in your own financial estate planning that you will not hear anywhere else. Now, real estate and development as a topic has been included in the Mayor of Money podcast series because for many people, the principal residence has become a significant store of wealth and provides access to future income and retirement for many. And real estate has become a significant asset class that many individuals invest in. And the order of government that has the most impact on housing in general are municipalities, and I happen to have a little bit of experience there. But today, on the podcast today, I am very pleased to welcome my first guest to talk about the whole real estate and development area. His name is Michael Collins Williams, and he is the Chief Executive Officer at the West End Home Builders Association. And Mike is a registered professional planner, a graduate from the Ryerson University School of Urban Planning. Over the last 17 years, Mike's career has been dedicated to the Ontario Home Builders Association, involved in a lot of government relations strategy. And his tenure has provided extensive experience working with different provincial regulations, including the growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe area, transit planning, transit-oriented development, the provincial policy statement, environmental assessment, species at risk, and conservation authorities. Mike also serves as the chair for a 735-unit high-rise condominium. And that's like being mayor of a small town, I'm sure. And Mike brings not only an Ontario perspective to planning and development issues, but also a transatlantic experience, as he has led several Canadian developer business delegations to Europe to learn from the most innovative development sites in Reykjavik, Stockholm, Göteborg, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Copenhagen, and Malmo. And Mike, I've actually been to 5 out of those 7 cities that you led those delegations to, and certainly learned an awful lot that I believe can be applied in North America. So Mike, welcome to the Mayor of Money podcast series. I really appreciate you taking time today to be with me. You've been the CEO of the West End Home Builders Association for 8 months or so. It's been a challenging time on a lot of fronts. How are you making out?
So far, so good. I think I'll definitely say that starting a new job in the middle of a pandemic is definitely strange. I sort of joked to my wife that on my last day at my previous job, I threw on a pair of track pants and walked downstairs to the kitchen table and opened my laptop. And the next day was my first day at the new job, and I threw on a pair of track pants and walked down to the kitchen table and opened the laptop. So didn't feel a whole lot different from day to day, but I think we're all managing as best we can. Definitely excited now to actually be out and about and meeting some people live in person and sinking into some issues. And thank you for the long introduction. I love that you pronounced a few of those Swedish cities correctly. So
Göteborg, right? Göteborg. It's not Gothenburg, it's Göteborg. I learned that.
I learned that the hard way when I said it the wrong way to one of the locals.
So you are the CEO of the West End Home Builders Association, and that is one of many different local associations across the province that form the Ontario Home Builders Association. In general, what is the mandate of the CEO of the West End Home Builders?
Well, broadly speaking, we're an integrated network right across the country from coast to coast, from St. John's, Newfoundland to Victoria, BC. There's just over 7,000 members of the Canadian Home Builders Association, broken down by each province. You mentioned earlier, I previously worked with the Ontario Home Builders Association, which has just under 4,000 members, organized into 27 local associations across the province, with the West End covering the Hamilton and Burlington area. We're the 3rd largest in terms of membership. Obviously, in the GTA, build is the largest, and there are smaller rural associations in places like Sarnia, Grey Bruce, Halliburton County. In terms of my role, we have a small but mighty staff at the West End Home Builders Association. So we cover a wide range of issues, everything from professional development and education for our members to events. We have things like an awards program recognizing the very best in the industry in terms of architecture, design, energy efficiency. Speaking of energy efficiency, the Ontario Home Builders Association is a part owner of the Quality Corporation. They run the Energy Star program in Ontario, which is helping home builders build houses above code in terms of energy efficiency, and they run a significant education program. And then part of my role is, of course, government relations and advocacy, focusing on housing affordability and choice for Ontarians for all types and tenures of housing.
So, but the purpose of the Home Builders Association in general is to represent the industry and the people and the suppliers to the development industry that creates homes for new households in Canada.
It's got a few different roles. I think the public-facing role is to represent the industry in terms of government relations, in terms of programs like today, talking about the industry and what we do. And I think internally, a lot of what we do is sort of the education, the professional development, and quite frankly, networking. It's a great opportunity for suppliers and manufacturers to be able to meet with and interact with builders in terms of bringing their products to market. We are actually the largest industry in Canada. I think a lot of people sort of think of the automotive industry in Ontario or the oil and gas industry out in Alberta, but the housing industry across Ontario employs both on-site and off-site around 500,000 Ontarians, contributing billions of dollars to the economy, wages, et cetera. And I think what makes our industry unique compared to some other industries is we're really in every community. It's not like an individual Ford or Toyota plant that's in one community. From Thunder Bay to Cornwall and from Windsor to Ottawa, there are home builders, big and small. In a lot of cases, it's small family businesses or renovators. In terms of the construction trades, again, they are literally in every community. And in the products that we use in our homes, most homes in Ontario are built using wood products, and that wood is generally from Ontario and Quebec's forestry sector, or in terms of the concrete, the bricks, et cetera, the aggregates tend to be quite close to market and local. So we're somewhat unique that you can't pick up a plant and move it to Mexico or move it to China. Our supply is land, and we are based locally here in Ontario, or in the case of today's discussion, Hamilton and Burlington.
Well, let's jump in. Let's jump into some of the substantive discussion and recognizing in the last couple of years in particular, housing prices in the Hamilton census metropolitan area, which includes Burlington as well as Hamilton and Grimsby, have increased dramatically. And the cost of home ownership has soared. And who would think that Hamilton is the third most expensive housing market in North America? How could that be?
It's a shocking statistic that Oxford Economics just released a report a few weeks ago, and it compares the cost of housing to the average household income. And Hamilton is right behind Toronto and Vancouver, and is actually more expensive comparing those metrics than the most expensive cities in the United States, like San Francisco. So that is a significant concern. I think the Hamilton census metropolitan area was often perceived as an affordable community for attainable housing for families. And that's really changed in the last few years. I think the changes were the cost of housing seemed to detach itself from sort of basic economic principles really began in 2016, 2017. And that's around the time that we started seeing population really start to increase. We've always been a growing province. but it's really in the last 5 years that growth actually accelerated. So if you don't mind, I can sort of zoom out and look at a sort of Ontario-wide perspective that the Greater Golden Horseshoe, this is the area that wraps around from Niagara through Waterloo region, right around Collingwood and Peterborough, including Hamilton and Toronto. That's roughly 10 million people today. It's forecasted to grow to about 15 million people by 2051. And that's equivalent to the entire population of Greater Montreal moving to this region. That is an incredible amount of growth. And this isn't just hypothetical growth. This growth is what we're already seeing. Ontario's population grew by 600,000 from 2010 to 2015, and that accelerated to about 1 million people the last 5 years. That's a significant acceleration and speeding up of growth, and that's right around the time that housing prices really started to take off. And the fact of the matter is that we are not building enough housing supply to meet the growing demand. And this is a problem right across Southern Ontario. I really think it's centered around Toronto, that despite the increase in growth and in population coming to the region, the amount of new housing built in Toronto in the first half of the decade versus the second half of the decade barely budged. So now it's sort of created a, call it a musical chairs effect or a cascading effect, where people are being priced out of Toronto and they're looking to other opportunities in other communities. A recent report by Mike Moffat found that just last year, 60,000 people on net moved out of Toronto and Peel region to other parts of Ontario. So I know probably some of your listeners in the Hamilton or Burlington area anecdotally hear of more and more people leaving Toronto, moving to Hamilton. And the numbers from the Smart Prosperity Institute, a report done by Mike Moffat, confirm that. And now there's a lot of displacement occurring, as you mentioned, the cost of housing in Hamilton going up. So a lot of folks in Hamilton, well, they're now moving out to St. Catharines. They're moving up the 403 to Woodstock and London. And that in turn is displacing people from those communities. So it's almost a straight line outwards from the CN Tower of displacement as in a cascading effect as people are moving further and further out to communities that we never imagined we'd see the kind of growth that we're seeing in the last few years.
It is interesting that you have a federal government that determines immigration policy and that welcomes with open arms 400,000, 450,000 new immigrants to Canada on an annual basis. And it's a good thing, because without that, our economy would be challenged because of our aging population. So immigration helps economically in a significant way. And then the province sort of tries to put some definition around how that growth should occur. And it's up to the municipalities to actually execute and implement new housing. And that becomes a bit of a challenge with people who already live in existing communities who don't really want much change, don't want to see their community change too much. How do we deal with that? I mean, if I had the answer, I might still be in office. But how do we deal with that particular challenge of recognizing that communities like Burlington and Hamilton for sure have to grow, have to accept their share of population growth and job growth over the next 20, 30 years, in fact, on an ongoing basis? How do we bring people together and get people to be supportive of growth, or is that just a pipe dream?
That is the million-dollar question, and I don't know if I have a great answer for that, but you hit on a few themes there. You mentioned federal policy, provincial policy, and local policy, and it's interesting that within this housing equation, all three levels of government are involved, and the execution of the public policy and actually delivering the amount of housing that we need for a growing population, it's become a little muddled in terms of who actually holds the pen and how it's executed. So we've just had a federal election, and the Liberal Party has been returned to power, and they are planning on bringing in 400,000 people per year for the next few years, which is an increase of what we've had in the past. And most of those people are likely going to settle in the Vancouver and Greater Toronto and Hamilton areas. So that sort of continues on the theme of accelerating growth. And you're absolutely right what you said before about, we need these people. I can speak just for our industry. We've got skilled trades shortages in terms of the people that are going to build the housing that we need. So we absolutely need immigration. We need to bring in people with skills, with the skilled trades. You'd be rather shocked actually walking around a construction site as to the average age of a lot of the people building the homes in the condo towers and apartment towers. We have an aging workforce, and we do need to bring in young, talented people. But to your question around how we deal with sort of the politics around growth, it is a challenge. For better or for worse, we have a political environment where there are a lot of people opposed to intensification and density. There's also a lot of people opposed to urban boundary expansions, concerns around what's been termed urban sprawl. So it's sort of a difficult political environment in which people don't want either option. And then there's sort of a third option, the missing middle, which is sort of small scale infill in existing communities. And well, it's missing. And it's missing for a reason. And we don't have a public policy framework that supports the type of that construction. Unfortunately, a lot of the politics around growth are, for better or for worse, existing residents in communities that they've moved to, and they like their communities. So they don't really want to see change. But nobody really speaks for future residents. And that is a challenge when we've got a growing population and people from around the world are coming to contribute to Canadian society, but they may not be able to achieve that Canadian dream of home ownership. And we have a lot of young people who are doing everything right. They're getting well educated, they're getting skills, they're entering into the workforce, and they don't have the same opportunities in terms of being able to afford a home, be it a ground-oriented home or be able a condo, or even make rent as previous generations did. And I think that is a failure in many cases on our leaders at all levels of government, that young people today don't necessarily have the same opportunities as young people in previous generations. And I'm actually worried in the long term about social cohesion and political unrest potentially if there are so many people are being left behind, more so than in the past. So there's a lot of threads we can dive into there, but I think the last thing I'll say to that question is the local interest is different than the public interest. The local interest is often existing homeowners who like things just the way they are. And just because they don't want to see growth doesn't mean that's not in the public interest. It is the role of senior levels of government, the provincial government and the federal government, to set broader public policy that is in the public interest in terms of how we manage and plan for growth. And sometimes that creates friction or rubs up against the local politics that we experience ward by ward in communities like Hamilton and like Burlington.
That was a very diplomatic answer to a very challenging area. So recognizing that Burlington doesn't have any more room to grow out, I mean, that's been the existence in Burlington for some time. The current and future state of Burlington is intensification, infill, and redevelopment. And when farmland was being paved over up in the Orchard area and the Alton area of Burlington, nobody cared because nobody lived around there. Now, when you've got development in the downtown and around the GO stations, you're getting closer and closer and closer to where people already live, which becomes more of a challenge. How do communities continue to grow and continue to thrive when they do not have greenfield development possibilities, or very little? How do they grow? And you mentioned the missing middle. Wouldn't mind you expanding on that a little bit as well.
So, well, let's talk about the missing middle first. So the missing middle is sort of the housing typologies that are sort of between the low-rise single detached home and the high-rise or the mid-rise. So a lot of communities like Burlington, the predominant form of housing is single-family homes throughout many of the neighborhoods. Or when you get into the downtown areas or around some of the GO stations, sort of mid-rise and high-rise buildings. But there's there's a whole other universe of other housing options out there, ranging from semi-detached, triplexes, quadplexes. There are opportunities around townhomes. A newer form of housing that we're seeing more and more of are stacked townhomes. Small scale housing opportunities like laneway suites, granny flats, secondary suites. I call it the Fonzie suite, the unit above the garage. There are all sorts of other housing options out there that, for better or for worse, don't really exist in a significant volume in most communities across Ontario. And the reason for that is public policy. Our zoning, and it's a term from the United States, is exclusionary, in that it only allows, in most residential areas, single family homes and nothing but single family homes. There's a number of jurisdictions in the United States that have opened up their zoning in residential communities to new options. And these options aren't, suddenly throwing a 5 or 6 story building in the middle of a residential community. This is allowing a lot to be split and perhaps a couple smaller homes be built. This is allowing, a couple townhomes to be built on a corner lot. It's a form of what planners like myself call gentle density, in that it's slightly increasing densities, or in some cases, it's almost invisible density, that if you're walking down a sidewalk, you'll obviously notice if a tower is going up, but if it's a single detached home next to a semi-detached home, next to a couple 2.5 story townhomes, it doesn't really change the rhythm and the feel of the street. It's still a low-rise street, predominantly lower density, but there are a lot of benefits to bringing about new housing options. There's the affordability factor. Typically, a townhome is going to be more affordable for a young family that's still looking for a patch of grass for their kids to play on than a single family home. So we're introducing more options and more opportunities in our existing neighborhoods. It's also contributing to the social fabric of the neighborhoods, that in a lot of existing communities, in some cases, school enrollments are dropping. So it's a great way of bringing more families into those communities to use our existing infrastructure. There's less strain on existing infrastructure. The pipes are already in the ground. The hydro is already built. The streets already exist. So it's an opportunity to use our existing infrastructure. And I think the last point is that by slightly increasing the density of existing neighborhoods, that brings other opportunities for retail. I mean, the corner coffee shop is more likely to exist if there's a few more potential customers in the neighborhood. The neighborhood pub down the street, more likely to exist if there's a few more customers in the neighborhood. So it's a great way of encouraging also different mixtures of uses and this idea of a 15-minute city.
That is a challenge, going into existing neighborhoods, even on a gentle densification plan. It is very, very challenging, and we need our elected officials to lead and educate people, as opposed to just saying no because people don't want it. There's an education process that needs to take place, representing the public interest, as you say, and not necessarily just the local interest.
And the politics are very interesting around this, and I'm somewhat empathetic to local politicians that are dealing with this, at public meetings in the evening, and some of the challenges around growth. They are not easy challenges. And this is why we've seen in a number of American jurisdictions, intervention at the state level. So California has passed new legislation quite recently to allow for more missing middle housing typologies within existing neighborhoods. The existing communities, towns and cities across California were not rising to the challenge in terms of allowing more housing supply. And California is one of the worst states in the United States in terms of the cost of housing. It's a growing state. Housing has gotten out of control in terms of the cost. And it's not just become an issue for housing, it's now an issue for economic development, attraction and retention of talent, and for employers that are competing for wages with other jurisdictions like Boston and Austin, especially in the tech sector, where housing is much more affordable. So for a talented young person, they have options in terms of where they're going to live. And I think the cost of housing is going to play more and more into the decisions that young people make in terms of where they live. So California is a great example of where they started to see this not as just a housing issue, but an economic competitiveness issue. And the state intervened. It changed legislation and required all communities to allow for more housing options within their communities. And I think this is something that we are possibly going to see in Canada and in Ontario specifically, potentially more intervention by the provincial government in terms of ensuring that our communities, be it Burlington, be it Barrie, be it Hamilton, be it Oshawa throughout the greater Golden Horseshoe, are stepping up to the plate and are building enough housing to meet the demands of a growing population and different types of housing. We need a diversity of housing types to meet the demands of a growing population and for the full life cycle. The demands of a 25-year-old are different than a 50-year-old and different than a 75-year-old in terms of the type of housing we need.
It was interesting, Mike, when I was mayor and a councillor, and we would have development application meetings, public meetings, and we'd often hear from people who would say something like, you know, why can't you be like Paris? Paris doesn't have any buildings that are taller than 6 stories. Why don't you have a 6-story limit? Well, we could have a 6-story limit like Paris, but in Paris, 6-story buildings are everywhere. So there'd have to be a willingness to trade off to get rid of the taller buildings, to have a lot more 6-story buildings in existing single-family home neighborhoods. And I think when it comes right down to it, people may opt for the taller buildings and be exclusionary in their single-family home neighborhoods. But it is a fascinating challenge. The politics are fascinating. Human nature is interesting in dealing with these particular issues. One of the issues that comes up every time, certainly in downtown Burlington, probably Hamilton as well, maybe less so, is the issue of parking for condominium buildings. And there is a school of thought suggesting that there shouldn't be any minimums for parking in a condominium building. Leave it up to the market to determine how many parking spots should be in existence in a new development. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, Rick, you've hit on one of my favorite topics as an urban planner. So I suppose I'm a strange person that could talk about parking all day, but minimum parking standards are a bizarre piece of public policy that we have that in communities across Ontario, in North America for that matter, we typically have government policy that requires builders and developers to put in more parking than the market demands. And I think that this is a piece of public policy that should be in the dustbin or the trash can of history. And it's one of those few pieces of public policy that I think those on the right end of the political spectrum and those on the left end of the political spectrum should all agree on. From a somewhat more left-leaning perspective, minimum parking standards forcing more parking than is necessary contributes to automobile use. It contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. It is not what you need when you're trying to encourage more people to take transit, and it's not what you need when you're encouraging more people to use active transportation such as cycling or walking. And from a more right-leaning or business perspective, it's requiring more than the market demands. It's increasing the costs, and it's just a bit bizarre to have a piece of public policy that's forcing significant additional cost. I mean, we started the program talking about housing affordability and the escalating cost of housing. An underground parking spot is going to cost roughly between $60,000 and $80,000, depending on where the water table is and what the soil conditions are. And if buildings are being mandated to provide more parking than the market demands, you're significantly adding to the cost of that building, and those costs simply get thrown into the cost of the units of the housing. So it's a bizarre piece of public policy. There are different jurisdictions that are starting to either eliminate minimum parking standards entirely or they're starting to chip away at it around transit stations. So, if you're thinking about Burlington, it's a little strange to be building condos and apartment buildings right next to a GO station and forcing them to dig 3 or 4 levels of underground parking. We're also in a society where younger people are driving less and rates of car ownership are lower than previous generations. And we're also in a society that's increasingly using ride-hailing apps in terms of on-demand services. And as the technology is improving, we're probably looking forward in the next decade or two to much more autonomous vehicles, meaning we won't necessarily need those underground parking spots. And then you've got stranded assets. So think about all of the condos, all of the apartment buildings, or even commercial and office buildings that have multiple floors of underground parking that may be a stranded asset in a decade or two that nobody needs, nobody wants, and there are significant costs for long-term maintenance and upkeep. So I would be the first to say, let's just get rid of minimum parking standards entirely and let the free market determine how much parking is necessary on a case-by-case basis.
So with regard to car use, the city of Burlington is focusing growth in the area around the 3 GO stations, which makes it a lots of sense for all sorts of different reasons. But one of the challenges of moving into an area like that that's relatively new is a lack of public and private amenities, whether it be a pub that you mentioned or a hardware store, a beer store, a pub, cafe, whatever. How can municipalities work with the right people to make sure that this new development around existing GO stations is complete in the fact that they're true walkable communities where you can walk for your groceries, walk to the hardware store, walk to the bank, walk to transit, and have very little need for a car? That's one of the areas that I really struggled with as mayor, trying to figure out how you could implement that in such a way as I described.
That's a challenge. And I think that the GO station areas in particular in Burlington, they're going to emerge as complete communities, but it's not going to happen overnight. It will be a decade plus, maybe decades in the making. But I do think that the municipality, in partnership with the region and the province, is doing some great work. But again, it will take time. We do have a provincial growth plan that mandates specific densities around what's called major transit station areas. And Burlington has 3 of those, the Appleby, the Burlington, and the Aldershot GO station. And this is where most of our future growth is going to be focused. Now, you did mention that these areas don't have a lot of amenities currently. A lot of them are fairly large parking lots. Coming off of the parking topic, it's interesting that Metrolinx is actually the largest owner of parking spaces of any corporation in North America. So it's great that we're looking at the parking lots for future development potential. So there's going to be a lot of private sector investment from my members in the West End Home Builders Association. But I think it's important that there's also partnerships to ensure that we're building affordable housing so that we have mixed income communities. And we do need to look at, you mentioned the retail opportunities. I think there's a lot of sophisticated developers out there now that aren't just doing residential. They're looking at mixed use, which is absolutely critical. We do not want Burlington to become simply a bedroom community where there are a whole lot of condos and apartments at those GO stations and people are just walking to the GO station, hopping on the GO train and going to Toronto for work. I think we do need a strong focus on mixed use, on mixed tenure. And frankly, there's going to need to be some public sector investment too. We need to look at public service facilities, be it libraries to encourage trips there, community centers, recreational facilities, and we may need to look at things like differential development charges rates or some, I'll call it clever financial tools or planning tools to try to incentivize some certain uses or some certain development types to go in there. And we also have a beautiful downtown in Burlington, and I don't think that can be forgotten. The Urban Growth Center has been moved out of downtown Burlington, but I think it is still going to be a node where we are going to see significant development interest. because quite frankly, people want to live there. I think the GO stations are likely going to attract more younger people because they'll probably be priced more affordably on a per square foot basis than downtown Burlington. It probably will attract some of that commuting workforce population. But downtown Burlington is still going to be very attractive to, I'll call it downsizers and retirees. For a lot of people in Burlington, as they're aging in place, they're going to find that their home's probably a little too big, getting difficult to manage. Some people are going to not really want to keep going up and down stairs as they get into their 70s and 80s. They're probably not going to want to move into a 1 or 2 bedroom condo right by a GO station. They may be looking for an opportunity downtown near the waterfront in a more, I'll call it a higher end building. The two markets between downtown Burlington and the GO stations, they're quite different in terms of the buyers. And downtown Burlington's got a lot of great amenities. You've got the waterfront, you've got shops, you've got City Hall. There is an existing complete community there that regardless of a change in planning policy for moving the urban growth center, I still think it's going to be a focus of continued investment, and for better or for worse, probably some continued controversy around the politics of growth and additional towers going up there. But the fact of the matter is people want to live there. And if people want to live there, they're going to invest.
Exactly. And there is something like 30 development applications for tall buildings happening right now in some particular stage of the process within downtown Burlington. So you're right, despite the potential change of designation and moving the urban growth center, there's still going to be lots of growth continue into downtown Burlington. It is interesting, though, people's views about downtown Burlington. I remember meeting somebody when I was mayor. We were going on a walking tour, and we're going on a walking tour of downtown, looking at the features of different buildings and pointing out what future development was going to come along. And a gentleman said to me, "You just got to say no to all this." And I said, "Oh," and I hadn't met him before, and I asked him, "So where do you live? How long have you lived there?" Well, I moved from Mississauga, moved into a downtown condo 6 months before, and he was able to get in, but he didn't want us to let anybody else in. And that's
slam the gate behind you when you come in, right?
Drawbridge planning, right? Pull up the bridge, don't let anybody else in. And it's such a delicate thing. And I guess it's so natural for people to be protective of the areas where they live. And that's why it's critically important that people be educated and brought on board to understand the challenges that are being addressed by new development. But last thing I want to raise, we're going to wrap this up shortly. I've enjoyed our discussion, Mike. I think you are obviously a very talented guy. You know planning very well, and you could be doing a lot of different things because you've got a range of experience and insights. But in Hamilton, recently there's been lots of discussion about whether the urban boundary expands or doesn't expand, and they focus the growth inside the urban boundary. What is the position of your organization and why? Most people watching this will probably know the position, but can you articulate it?
Hamilton is also similar to Burlington that just talking about a destination of growth. Hamilton's not an island unto itself. It is part of this broader, greater Golden Horseshoe. And, as there are people increasingly leaving Toronto, looking for family-friendly housing, Hamilton is a great city, a great place to move, a great place to open a business. I'm very excited about Hamilton as a mid-sized city. I think it's very well positioned in North America with the health sector there, with an emerging tech sector, and with a really interesting, cool downtown where there's lots of entertainment opportunities. Hamilton's growth is accelerating. It is forecast to grow by nearly 250,000 people, 236,000 people by 2051. And for better or for worse, not all of these people are going to be able to fit within the existing urban boundary. Hamilton needs to do three things, and we've touched on these themes throughout our discussion today. Hamilton needs to grow up. There's going to be a lot of intensification in downtown Hamilton. The provincial and federal governments are investing significantly, billions of dollars into a new 14-stop LRT that stretches right across the downtown. That is going to be followed by significant private sector investment for housing opportunities there. A new GO station opened up West Harbour in downtown Hamilton. Great connection to the rest of the 905 in Toronto. So that will be also a center for intensification. So our association is very supportive of increasing densities and intensification in Hamilton. We talked about the missing middle earlier. Hamilton's going to need to grow in, and that's sort of into the existing neighborhoods with more missing middle housing opportunity and ground oriented. And the political controversy right now seems to be on the third option, which is Hamilton is also going to need to grow out. The professional planning staff at the City of Hamilton have recommended a small urban boundary expansion of 1,300 hectares, phased and spread out over the next 30 years. So ultimately, the staff recommendation is of this nearly 250,000 people coming to house 60% of that within the existing urban area and plan for 40% of the growth to occur through a boundary expansion. Now, historically, Hamilton's been running between 30 and 40% intensification on an annual basis for the last decade or so. So jumping from 40% to 60% is ambitious. The city staff have called that ambitious. Our association is not entirely comfortable that they'll actually meet those targets, but we are supporting the recommendations of professional staff. A number of councillors are suggesting that Hamilton should not have a boundary expansion and should have 80% of all growth happen within the existing urban envelope. That would mean that nearly 3/4 of all future housing units are in apartments. So whether that's condos, apartments, but in high-rise and mid-rise buildings. And, we know that from a lot of the people coming into Canada internationally, or a lot of the people that are leaving higher density areas like Toronto, they're looking for more housing options. They're looking for a little bit of elbow room. A lot of people, whether planners or politicians like it, they want a backyard. And that is part of the reason why we are seeing absolutely incredible growth numbers. The fastest growing places in Ontario right now are places like Collingwood, Shelburne, Tillsonburg, areas that were never planned for this type of growth. But people are voting with their feet, and they're leaving some of the higher density urban areas because they want to have the opportunity to live in a ground oriented house, be that a townhome, a semi-detached, or a single family home. So our association, our membership, we do support a small boundary expansion, but we also are very supportive of the intensification happening in downtown Hamilton. And I'm quite excited. I think we're going to see a new skyline emerge in the city, and Hamilton really emerge as one of the most exciting, dynamic, mid-sized cities in all of North America.
Well, Mike, we covered a lot of ground today, and I want to say thank you very much for taking the time to be on the Mayor of Money with me today. I really enjoyed our discussion. Thanks. The West End Home Builders Association is in good hands under your leadership, and I wish you all the best in the upcoming years dealing with all the challenges around housing, because they're not going to disappear. They're going to continue, and we need people like you to be involved. On that note, thank you everyone for listening or watching the Mayor Money podcast with Mike Collins-Williams as my special guest. And remember, if you have a particular guest or a topic you want me to feature on a future podcast, please let me know. In the meantime, stay positive and test negative, and thanks for tuning in.